Hello watch enthusiasts! Now the search for an affordable dive watch which offers decent specifications and a good looking design is one which is very difficult on a market with so many options currently available, and really one sees new dive watches in the affordable segment being offered on an almost daily basis, with brands such as Citizen and Seiko having released a few models recently, and really a selection of other pieces being released over the past few months. And for Zelos, which is a brand which I've shown on the channel before and has received quite a lot of support over the past few years, it's been an interesting period because one's seen from this brand quite a lot of very outlandish designs for dive watches. But they're looking to a new market now because the owners behind Zelos have created a new brand called Axios. And this brand is looking to create a watch which is much more accessible in terms of design than the rather outlandish looks of those Zelos dive watches. And this is the product, the Ironclad. And it's a piece which I was curious to review because I have handled Zeloses before and reviewed them, and found the quality to be very impressive, so naturally I was drawn to the concept of reviewing these pieces. And so today I'd like to speak about these watches which offer you a 500-metre stainless steel dive watch with a very good build and a very good Swiss movement for an affordable price and one which you wouldn't expect to see. And so I think they're an interesting proposition, especially with things like dual-tone ceramic bezels, which you really wouldn't normally see at this sort of price range. Now, before I begin the video, I would of course like to encourage you to like, share and subscribe if you enjoy this video or find the content interesting. And also do follow me on Instagram at the address which is now on the screen to be able to access additional content which wouldn't normally appear here on the channel. And before I begin the video, I would also like to make very clear that for the sake of my integrity and the sake of the quality of the review, I do think it's worth stating that whilst I don't get to keep either of these watches, I will have to state this video is a sponsored piece of content, so take that as you will, because I think it's an important thing to say. Also, I think it should be stated that when I review a watch, if I don't find it up to the standards of the channel and I don't feel that it would support my integrity to talk about it, I simply won't show it on the channel, so take that as you will, but I think it's important to give this disclaimer at the start of a video. Now, when I was given the opportunity to review this watch, I was at first concerned that it was going to end up being another Submariner homage, which I think is a risk, especially with brands such as Steinhardt producing watches which are very successful and I have no problem with at all, but it does become a little bit dull having watches which are created in the same style. But I'm rather lucky to be able to say that they haven't fallen down this trap, and have instead created something which I think is very interesting. And whilst I don't think that it's for everyone, I think that it will appeal to a broader market than the Zelos products which they've produced under that sister brand. And first of all, I think I should speak about the general build of the watch and also the feel of the watch, because these are both very important attributes. Now, the size of the watch is 40mm, so they've kept it quite conservative, with an overhang to the bezel, as you can see. And the build is 316L stainless steel, so industry standard steel, and it's finished extremely well. Zelos are of course known for very good quality cases in terms of being very well finished, and this does have a more simple finish in terms of design than a lot of those Zelos products, as one sees polished sides which are in extremely high polish, and they really are mirror polish, which you would expect from Seiko but not from a micro brand, which is very impressive. And then one has brushing on the top of the lugs which is very fine and works very well in terms of giving a refined look to the watch, and one which is wearable in a great deal of different circumstances. Now, this is a 500-metre diver, so there is a certain amount of bulk to the case itself, and in stainless steel it is a heavy watch, although I suppose a lot of that weight is because it has a completely solid stainless steel bracelet. Now, the case itself is 46mm from lug to lug, but there is an overhang, as you can see, which extends it by about 2mm on each end when it's sitting on the wrist, so this shouldn't be a problem because that is part of the bracelet, and so creates an overhang. One does also see the fact that the watch is relatively thick at 13.8mm, but wears thicker than its design would suggest because of the bulk of the case, and it's much like a Tudor Black Bay in the sense that the mid case is quite thick with a very shallow case back and thin top, so you notice the weight more, but actually once it's on the wrist this weight disappears, which is a nice attribute and something which one doesn't tend to see in a lot of watches. On the opposite side of the case, one sees the fact that the crown is guarded by two polished crown guards, which are done again to the same mirror finish, which really works extremely well to give a very premium look and feel to the watch. And there is a signed and very deeply engraved crown, which again is a rarity at this price range. And I think from the beginning of this video, I should state that when this watch launches on Kickstarter on the 20th of August, this watch will be $399 as the base price, whilst the final sales price will be around $599. So I think it's worth noting all of this whilst seeing the watch, because it puts things in perspective in terms of the quality. Because really, whatever you think of the design of this watch, and I'm sure there'll be very varied opinions, the quality of engineering in terms of the choice of materials and the product as a standalone piece, really it's difficult to argue with the value. And so it is a 500 metre diver, but doesn't have a helium escape valve. And I suppose it's one of those things that some people like and some people don't. Helium escape valves don't really serve much purpose for the vast majority of us, and do create an extra area through which the watch can leak if it's not serviced properly. So I can understand leaving that out on this watch. At a higher price range, perhaps it would have been nice, but at this price range, I can understand the choice. And the crown is quite flat, though doesn't sit flush, as you can see with the crown guards, and still protrudes somewhat. Looking at the front of the watch, one should note the fact that this watch has a 120-click unidirectional bezel, and it rotates very easily. It has an extremely tight build. There is no play in this bezel at all. You see, once it's seated, there really isn't any movement at all. And I do have two examples, so I'll show you the other colourway, but I think this is the best one to be able to show you the dial and the case build from the front in the best possible light. You'll also note the fact that the bezel is almost Tudor-Pelagos-esque in its design because of that artificial pip at 12 o'clock, which is actually entirely engraved into the bezel, because all of the bezel is luminous, as opposed to simply being that pip. And I think that the choice is a wise one, because it gives you a focal point to be able to really see the watch easily if you're using it in the dark. But you'll see this in the Lume shot later on in the video. Now, this watch does have a sea dweller, you could say, style bezel, because it's fully graduated, and on all the models in the range it is ceramic, so you get that high scratch resistance, which really does allow you to be able to use the watch more roughly, especially since it also has a sapphire crystal on the front. And it's with the details on this watch that one really notices the attention and the care, because you'll be able to see that this bezel is a two-tone ceramic bezel. Until a few years ago, it really was only Rolex that produced these styles of bezels, but now we see other manufacturers able to produce two-colour bezels in ceramic, and so this one is dark blue with black at the top, giving you this Batman-coloured bezel, which I think is great fun in terms of giving you something very different to see on the wrist. From the front, you can also see that this watch comes in other colourways, and so it does come in a variety of different versions, and this is probably the most bright in terms of its attributes because of this orange hand for the minutes, matched by the orange seconds, and of course that orange on the bezel. And this gives you enhanced visibility and legibility during the day, although it does pose a problem for legibility at night, which I'll show you in the Lume shot, and I think is something which you need to bear in mind with this watch, because I have found that as a bit of a problem with this watch, because the Lume in white is significantly more powerful than that in orange, which does create a bit of an imbalance when you're looking at the watch. But speaking more about the crystal on this watch, you get a very slightly domed sapphire crystal, as you can see, and the design of this bezel, it means that you end up with an incredibly fine lip between the edge of the crystal and the bezel, which you almost can't see and certainly can't feel, which means that you get this perfect flow of ceramic into sapphire, which is a real attribute which shouts quality on this watch, and something which I appreciate. There is an AR coating on the inside of the crystal, so you can't scratch it on the outside, but it still gives you a certain resistance to glare, which, as you can see, works very well to allow this watch to remain legible, despite any glare that might be created by lighting. But the dial of this watch is an interesting part, because they haven't gone mad with anything outrageously outlandish, but instead have kept things quite simple, but of very high quality. This version features a sunburst blue, a sort of an electric blue finish, which is very clearly a sunburst effect, with an applied logo, as you can see, and applied indices, which are lumed. And the indices, as you will be able to see, curve gently downwards towards the dial in order to allow them to appear more integrated into the general design and give you a high legibility, because despite the fact that the 12 o'clock piece does not differentiate itself in shape from the other two, the fact that the date is placed at 6 o'clock allows you to immediately orientate the watch at night, which is a real benefit. The date is nicely cut, and on all the models matches the colour of the dial, which is another piece of care which I think is greatly appreciated, and which isn't seen from a lot of mainstream brands, but really is showing the attention to detail which is being taken from Zelos and put into this Axios brand. Then one sees the hands, and they're extremely sharply cut, and actually the other version is perhaps best for demonstrating this because of the fact the hands are polished. In some angles you see an absolute mirror polish, so you see the light reflecting directly back, whilst at other angles you're able to see the sheer flatness of the hands, and it does allow you to be able to see these hands as something which is finished much better than other competitors at this price range. So one sees a very sharp edge and a completely flat surface, which is rare and quite difficult to achieve, so I appreciate that. I also like the fact that the hands and the dial don't resemble something from other brands, which I think is important to differentiate this from other options on the market. The dial on this version is this glossy black, as you can see, but there does appear to be very subtle sunbursting underneath that, which is rare to see in something very different, which I must say I rather like. Looking at the back of this watch, one has a view of a very attractively embossed and then frosted surface, with this interesting view of a battleship, an early 1800s battleship, which was ironclad, hence the name of the watch, to give armouring. And this is an interesting design and certainly feels much more conventional than the experimental looks of Zelos watches, and so brings this watch into a very different territory in terms of its appeal to a buyer. And I think the case back is well done. It's simple in terms of detailing, but very well executed throughout, so I think that's what you will want in terms of being something of good quality, but without going overboard as an additional expense to the creation of the watch. But one thing does say quite a lot about this watch. It has a Sellita SW200 movement, and this is protected without the threat, I suppose, of water ingress through an exhibition caseback with a 500-metre dive rating. And so this Swiss-made movement offers you a good reliability in terms of being an automatic movement, which is from a very respected brand and which any watchmaker worth their salt can service, which gives you peace of mind when buying a watch of this sort, that it will be serviceable for years to come. And the movement offers you a 38-hour power reserve, automatic winding, and of course hacking and hand winding, so if the watch stops you can wind it up to make it start, but also hacking to stop the seconds to be able to adjust it to the second if you feel that you'd like to do so, or synchronise it to someone else's watch. And I think it's the perfect choice for this watch, and fits very much with the idea of being a watch which can be bought by anyone and enjoyed with all the features and specifications they might want. Now, I will also note the fact there isn't Swiss made on the dial, and that's because this watch isn't a Swiss made piece. It isn't 60% Swiss, but does have a Swiss movement, so that's something to bear in mind, but I must say I don't think that should put you off buying one if you happen to like this particular design. An aspect of this watch which I think increases the value significantly is the bracelet. And the bracelet is an oyster-style piece with these links which are almost symmetrical from top to bottom, as you can see, but are thick enough, and this is a key point, they're thick enough to carry the weight of the watch. Often one finds bracelets which are quite thin in terms of the link thickness and design, and so the weight of the watch feels imbalanced because the watch head is falling about, whilst the bracelet itself has to be done up very tightly to be able to support that on the wrist. And I'm pleased to say this isn't a problem here because these links are quite short, which means that you can get a very close fit with these screw-in links. As you can see, they have screws on the one side, so you simply unscrew the link and remove it, which can be achieved with a small screwdriver. And also thanks to this very long micro adjustment setup on the clasp. And this is something to note, there isn't a quick adjustment for the bracelet here. So you're not able to slide it back and forth like on some bracelets from other brands. And this is something which I think would have been appreciated on this watch. Although I can understand the need to go for something more simple, given the fact that they're going for a Swiss movement in the watch head, and this does cost, especially when they're trying to offer a watch for the price they're offering it for. So I don't think it's a bad thing that they haven't offered a quick set for the bracelet, but the fact there is a micro adjustment here is still appreciated and does give you a lot of movement, where normally you would only see 3 notches, here you get a full 6, which does give you a lot of variation in the bracelet length if you happen to travel with the watch to somewhere warm, for instance, and you have to change the length in your hotel room with a tool which you might carry. But the quality here is very good, and the clasp itself is very different to what I've seen from other brands, in the sense that it doesn't feel like a clasp which has been picked off a shelf and simply had the logo put on it and been put with the watch. It feels very much like it's part of the product because of its shape, because of its bevels, and because you do get a great deal of security with it, with a very consistent finish with the bracelet and the case in general. And so you have this protection additional flip lock there, and then you have the double pushers to release the clasp itself, with this elbow joint to allow it to not fall off the wrist if you happen to not do up the clasp correctly, or there's a problem. And so I think it's a very solid choice for the bracelet of this watch, and whilst it doesn't have a particular amount of flair to it, I suppose that's not very much the idea here, where they're going for something which is inherently more simple. And really that is my only criticism of the watch in general, which is that I feel the design is a little bit too close to others on the market. And I can understand why they've done this, because that is the aim of this brand, to be something a bit more accessible. But somehow I do still long for the variation that one sees from Zelos, although I suppose that a Zelos buyer will simply go to Zelos, whereas Axios is appealing to a very different market, and one which is looking for more towards the quality side of things than the distinctive looks. Now at this point I'd like to show both watches in the dark, because I think it gives you an idea of the care taken with the Luminova on these watches. And they both use Superluminova of the same variety for the hands, as well as the dial and most parts of the bezel. But you will note that on the version which comes in orange and blue, one does see that the colour of the lume on the first 15 minutes of graduations on the bezel are orange. And this does give a very clear differentiating aspect when reading the time during the day, but it does mean that there is a slightly less powerful lume in this spot on the bezel in the dark, and this is a bit of an issue. But aside from that, I found the lume to be very, very good on both models, in terms of the dial application, and I think the fact that they've used applied indices with those metal rims has allowed more lume to be put onto the watch, thus allowing it to really glow in the dark very, very well. And the hands are also very legible with different lengths, and their width also contributing to the legibility. The bezels, as you can see, are fully lumed, which does mean that you have a much better ability to read the time in the dark than a single pip which can fade quite quickly. And these watches last between 5 and 6 hours in the dark, having been worn in relatively bright sunlight, thus allowing the watches to last through most of the night, though towards the later stages they may become rather faded and somewhat difficult to read. But I think this gives you a good idea of the quality of the Luminova used and the care taken for this price. On the wrist the watch looks like this, and my wrist is 7 inches in circumference, so it's a little bit over the average of about 6 3/4, but nonetheless gives you a good idea of how the watch wears. Now as you can see, it does sit quite high on the wrist, with its 13.8mm thickness to the top of that very gently domed sapphire crystal. However, you will also note the lug-to-lug length is actually rather short, and so it fits very comfortably on the top of the wrist, whilst the case back sinks into the wrist very well, and you do still get the height of that mid-case giving you that nice reflection as a result of the highly polished finish. The bracelet is comfortable on the surface of the skin and doesn't pull any hairs as a result of the fact that it does use quite large and thick parts, but with very, very narrow tolerances between them, which is exactly what you would want. And the solid end links do give a little bit more lean, if you will, to the edge of the watch than you would get normally if they went straight into the lugs of the watch, rather than sticking out a little bit. And so you get this curvature to the watch, which works very well on the wrist, and I've found to be very comfortable. The crown is quite short, as you can see in terms of its height, away from the case, and so as a result it doesn't really pose any problem in terms of digging into the wrist, or at least I haven't found anything of that sort, because the crown is a very good balance of functionality, but also of being easy to use as a result of the fact that it doesn't dig into the wrist and is comfortable. And so on the wrist I think the watch wears very well, and the only concern I can see is that for some people this will be too heavy, and that is a problem with it as a result of being a 500-metre diver. So I think that's both a benefit and a drawback, because those who want a very serious diver really will get it, but at the cost of weight. And before I conclude the video, I would like to note really my feelings about these watches, because I can certainly understand why they've been created to offer a buyer something a bit different in terms of moving away from the usual Zelos approach to something very different in terms of appearance. Instead they go for something more conservative and something which is more easily approached. On the other hand, I think they do still offer something different in terms of not really resembling anything else on the market with regards to their hand design, as well as the dials, and also the sheer quality of the bezels, which I don't think has been matched for this particular price range. And I think whilst many people will compare them to homages, I think that the differences which these watches have are significant enough to avoid that sort of discussion. At the same time, for me at least, and this is a personal note, I personally do find them a little bit too simple for my liking. That being said, the quality is very much there, and it really is a personal sort of feeling. But I feel it's important to say in any review that this is a personal view, but still it's important to note because it is still part of my view towards the watch and part of my opinion. But I'll be very curious to hear what you have to say about these watches in the comments down below, because I think they do offer something which I think in terms of value beats new Seiko models, which are available for the same price, and compete much more closely with £1,000 watches than they do £500 watches, as these watches are. And I think when they do launch on Kickstarter for $399, they will offer something which is unparalleled in terms of value. And that I do respect enormously, because it is a market which exists. And I think people want to have something of quality and integrity in terms of coming from a brand they know. And so I will conclude the video here, but if you enjoyed this video then do please like, share and subscribe to help the channel, and also to see more content and videos here in future. So thank you very much for watching. This is Arm on the Watch Guy, out.